The witch trials that happened here, these are the most famous witch trials anywhere in the world, and they're incredibly minor compared to most witch trials in the history of the world. Most of the witches that were put to death, or the people that were put to death for witchcraft, they were put to death in southern Germany. There were many witch trials in southern Germany, and they were putting people to death, especially during the 30 Years' War. The way that you get to the point where you're doing witch trials, it usually requires the rejection of the sovereignty of God. You know, Exodus does say that witches are to be put to death. Do not suffer a witch to live. But what happens when you get witch trials is people aren't trusting in God's procedures. What they see is they see phenomenon that they can't explain, and then they become fearful, and out of that fear they respond by starting to kill, typically fairly randomly. Typically the outsiders in the society, the widow who lives by herself. This is why, you know, this is kind of the picture of the witch, the person that's very solitary. From like 1400 to the beginning of the 1800s, the estimates are 40 to 60,000 witches were put to death in the Americas and in Europe. So the, 17 or 19 that are put to death here are pretty minor compared to what has happened other places in the world. But because of things that happened in America afterwards, these become the famous ones throughout the world, even though they were pretty much the end of the wave of putting, you know, of witch hunts, so to speak. So the witch hunts start in 1563, the modern witch hunts, where it's, and again, this is in Weissensteig, Germany, which is in southern Germany. And then in Norway, they start to do, there's hundreds of witches are put to death in the 17th century in Norway. And 70 witches are put to death in East Lothian, Scotland, because James VI, who later becomes James I, he's going to pick his bride up, Princess Anne of Denmark, and storms arise because they've rejected the idea of the sovereignty of God. Even though James VI was taught by Buchanan, he was taught Orthodox theology, but he was in rebellion to it. They get trapped. They think that they're not going to be able to get back. They end up after a couple weeks being able to get back, but they decide that this is because of witches. And so because of that, they start to put people to death. They put people to death first in Denmark, and then it spreads and they come back to Scotland, and they end up putting 60 witches to death in Scotland, or 70 witches to death in Scotland, all because these storms arose. And so because they're not seeing it as from the hand of God, they start to see it as from the hand of devils, basically. And so James VI is always a big advocate. Again, James I of England, he's always a big advocate of witch hunts. And so he even writes a book called Demonologia, which is basically the study of demons, in that he is like one of the famous people that is pushing forward for witch hunts. And he writes in there, experience daily proves how loath they are to confess without torture. So he's one of the first people that is really pushing, you don't do any rules, none of the biblical rules for justice, because they're witches, therefore they don't have any right, so you just torment them until they confess to what they've quote unquote done. And their torture, which I'm sure we'll hear later, the torture that they do here, the idea is, well, they're a witch, so you can torture them however you want to get them to confess that they're a witch. It's really a very blind view of the world, and a very, very much rejecting that God is a just God and that our duty is to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly before God. The witch hunts are like the exact opposite of that. So during the English Civil War, again, there's other things happening. People are very disturbed, so in that disturbance they see things happening and they start to associate it with witches. And so during the English Civil War, there's a man called Matthew Hopkins that becomes famous as the witch finder general. And so what he does is he ends up being directly associated with 300 witches being convicted and put to death. He wrote a book saying, here's how you test for a witch. And there were 3 tests for a witch. One was that they had a witch's mark. The idea of a witch's mark is when Satan was capturing them as a witch, his claws would claw them, and if you strip them naked, they would frequently do this in public with women, they would strip them naked and they would search their body for scrapes. And they would say that that was a witch's mark, and that was a sign that they were taken by Satan. Another wonderful test that they would use to justly decide if they were witches or not was the swimming test. The typical punishments for men were like to be scourged or things like that, but one of the typical punishments for women is that they would have what's called a dunking chair. They would strap them to a chair over a river to punish, and they would dunk them into the river. And so they decided to modify this to test for witches, in that they would take the chair off and they would tie the woman to it, and they would throw the woman into the river or the pond. And if she floated, then she was a witch, and if she drowned, then she wasn't a witch. So this was the test for witchcraft that he came up with, this Hopkins. Which, right, we hear these things and we think how insane they are, but we shouldn't think we're that far off. You hear all these people that freak out because they're UFOs. It's no different. It's the same thing. You see a phenomenon that you don't understand, and you go, oh no, look at all these things that are happening, instead of trusting in God and trusting in His ways. So we shouldn't think, oh, look how modern we are and look how primitive they are. It's all the same reaction when you reject God, as you have nothing else to explain the world with. And then the last one was called the piercing test. And what they would do is, especially where the witch's mark was, that they would stick something in, because allegedly when Satan scratched you, it would make that area numb, so you couldn't feel anything there. So they would allegedly take a pike and stick it in there. The problem is, they found out later they had fake pikes that you know, have you ever seen where they have the things where you like hit them and it looks like it's going to punch in, but it actually has a spring in it? So they would do that, or they would have blades that they would flip around where one end was very sharp and the other end was dull, and they would go, oh look, you can stab it in and there's no mark. I mean, they were framing these women, typically women. There were men that were put to death for witchcraft too, but they were framing them because they were using the paranoia, the fear in the society to say, here's the solution, put these people to death. So that's one thing that's going on. And then another element that I wanted to talk to is what's going on in Salem. Because we're not in Salem right now, we're actually in Danvers. Because Danvers used to be called Salem Village. In Salem, which we think of as Salem, that was Salem town. And so what happened is, in 1626, once they come here and they start to settle, you get two very distinct groups of people. You get the people that are working in the port, the people that are shipbuilders, the people that are dealing with cargo, the people that are in a town, and that's Salem town. And then you get a bunch of people that go out into the suburbs that are farmers. And so there becomes this, you know, the townspeople versus the farmers. This is like at the heart of it, right? Because these are an attack that people are using witchcraft to attack the other side. And so where we are is in the village. We're in the outskirts. But anyway, so by the time the witch trials are coming on, what happens is Salem Village is they're all under the same governance, because the town is the governance and so the village isn't. But about a third of the people are farmers out in the village and 2/3 are in the town. Everybody in the village had to walk to where Salem is every Sunday. They didn't want that, they wanted their own church. So they finally get permission, and this creates a lot of animosity because the townspeople didn't want them to have their own church. They wanted the church to be in town where they could control it, where they could get the tithes and everything. And so the farmers didn't want to have to walk to town every Sunday. And so what happens is that you get this arguing back and forth, and finally they agree to have a church here, but it ends up that they never get an ordained minister. And without an ordained minister, you can't actually have members to the church. They were still forced to be members in the Salem town church, even though they were going to church here. And without an ordained minister, they couldn't do the Lord's Supper, so if they ever wanted to do the Lord's Supper, they still had to go to Salem town. Deodat Lawson is the first one, and they promise that they'll ordain him. They can't come to consensus. And for the church to ordain him, he has the training that he can be ordained, but the church actually has to ordain him. And there's enough people that don't like him and enough people that do like him that they're fighting over whether he'll be ordained or not. They promised him to give him this house, they claimed that they just said he could live in this house. And so after 5 years of the people in Salem Village fighting with each other, finally Lawson leaves and goes, these people are hopeless. And that's when Samuel Parris comes, and he's the one whose daughter ends up being one of the witnesses that was for the Salem Witch Trials. But so these are the kind of the two things that are going on that end up, or the three things. One is the rejection of the sovereignty of God. One is that this witch hysteria has been going on worldwide. And then the last one is the tension that's between the town and the villages before the witchcraft stuff ends up creating the Salem Witch Trials. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. You can also visit www.discerninghistory.com for more videos and other resources.